What if I told you that Emperor Palpatine had a secret weapon more dangerous than the Death Star, more cunning than his political machinations, and more personal than his relationship with Darth Vader? What if that weapon was his own son, trained in the shadows of the galaxy, waiting for the moment to prove that even the Chosen One could be replaced? Today we're diving deep into one of the most chilling alternate timelines in Star Wars history. A story where blood runs thicker than loyalty, where the dark side of the Force reveals its most twisted family dynamics, and where Darth Vader faces an enemy who knows every secret weakness that made Anakin Skywalker fall. Picture this. Somewhere in the Outer Rim territories, on a world so remote that even Imperial star charts barely acknowledge its existence, a young man trains in combat, forms that predate the Jedi Order. His name is Marcus Palpatine, though he's never used that surname publicly. To the galaxy, he doesn't exist. To his father, the Emperor, he represents the ultimate contingency plan. Marcus was born 28 years before the Battle of Yavin, during Palpatine's early rise to power in the Senate. His mother was Lyra Cantana, a Naboo noble who caught the future Emperor's attention during a diplomatic function. Their affair was brief but intense, lasting only long enough for Palpatine to recognize something useful in their union. When Lyra discovered she was pregnant, Palpatine saw not a burden, but an opportunity. Unlike his public persona of the kindly senator, Palpatine revealed glimpses of his true nature to Lyra. He spoke of destiny, of power, of a galaxy that would one day bow to those strong enough to claim dominion. When Marcus was born, Palpatine felt the child's connection to the Force immediately. It was raw, untamed, and most importantly, it carried the genetic potential of the Sith bloodline. Lyra died when Marcus was 7, her death carefully orchestrated to appear like a speeder accident. Palpatine had grown tired of her questions, her demands for a normal family life, her inability to understand the greater destiny awaiting their son. With his mother gone, Marcus was taken to Dromund Kaas, the ancient Sith homeworld, where loyal cultists had maintained hidden temples for centuries. There, under the watchful eye of former Sith acolytes who had survived the Jedi purges, Marcus learned the true ways of the dark side. His training was brutal, methodical, and completely removed from the galaxy's awareness. While other children played with toys, Marcus meditated on pain and channeled his rage into power. While teenagers worried about romance and careers, Marcus studied ancient Sith texts and practiced lightsaber forms that had been forbidden for millennia. By the time Marcus reached adulthood, he had become something truly terrifying. A perfect fusion of Palpatine's cunning intelligence and raw Sith power, unmarked by the physical and emotional scars that defined Darth Vader. Where Vader relied on brute strength and intimidation, Marcus possessed subtlety. Where Vader's rage burned hot and obvious, Marcus's anger was cold, calculating, and infinitely more dangerous. Palpatine watched his son's progress with satisfaction, but also with typical Sith paranoia. He revealed Marcus's existence to no one, not even Vader. In Sith tradition, the apprentice would eventually challenge the master, but Palpatine had learned from the mistakes of his predecessors. Why wait for betrayal when you could engineer succession on your own terms? The Emperor's plan was elegant in its cruelty. Vader had grown powerful, yes, but also complacent. His defeats at Yavin and later setbacks had planted seeds of doubt about his apprentice's worthiness. More troubling still were the reports of Vader's encounters with young Luke Skywalker. Palpatine sensed something in these confrontations that worried him. Hesitation, conflict, the dangerous possibility that Vader might choose redemption over power. It was time for a test, not just of Vader's strength, but of his loyalty, his commitment to the dark side, and his usefulness as an apprentice. If Vader proved himself worthy by defeating this new threat, he would remain as Palpatine's right hand. If he failed, well, Marcus would make an excellent replacement, one whose loyalty could never be questioned because it was written in blood. Palpatine summoned Marcus to Coruscant for the first time in years. The young Sith arrived in secret, his ship's transponder codes identifying him as just another minor Imperial official. In the Emperor's private chambers, far from any recording devices or potential witnesses, father and son met as adults for the first time. Marcus knelt before the Emperor's throne, but his posture carried none of Vader's mechanical stiffness. His movements were fluid, predatory, like a Nexu preparing to strike. When he spoke, his voice carried the same cultured tones as his father's, but underneath lay something that even Palpatine found unsettling. An eagerness for violence that seemed almost joyful. "My Emperor," Marcus said, his head bowed, but his yellow eyes gleaming with anticipation. "I have felt your summons across the galaxy. I am ready to serve." Palpatine smiled, though his expression held no warmth. "Rise, my son. The time has come for you to prove your worth. Lord Vader has grown comfortable in his position. Comfortable and perhaps weak. You will test him. You will push him to his limits. And if he fails to meet the standards of a true Sith Lord, you will eliminate him." Marcus's smile was a perfect mirror of his father's, cold, calculating, and terrifyingly pleased. "What are my parameters, Master? How would you have me proceed?" "Carefully," Palpatine replied. "Vader must not know of your true identity until the moment is right. Let him believe he faces a new threat to the Empire, perhaps a surviving Jedi, or a rebel operative with unusual powers. Study him first. Learn his patterns, his weaknesses, his fears. Only when you are certain of victory should you reveal the truth." And so began one of the most dangerous games ever played in the Star Wars galaxy. Marcus adopted the identity of Darth Venator, a name that roughly translated to hunter in ancient Sith. He began his campaign against Vader not with direct confrontation, but with careful observation and strategic sabotage. Venator's first move was to infiltrate an Imperial supply depot that Vader was scheduled to inspect. Using the Force to cloud the minds of the facility's officers, he accessed classified shipping manifests and strategic planning documents. More importantly, he placed subtle Force impressions on various objects throughout the facility, psychic breadcrumbs that would lead Vader to draw specific conclusions about his mysterious enemy. When Vader arrived for his inspection, he immediately sensed something wrong. The Dark Lord of the Sith had survived the Clone Wars, the Jedi Purge, and countless assassination attempts by developing an almost supernatural awareness of danger. As he moved through the supply depot, his breathing grew more labored, his mechanical systems registering increased stress levels. The Force whispered warnings that Vader couldn't quite interpret. There was a presence here, recent but already gone, that felt both familiar and utterly alien. It carried the unmistakable taint of the dark side, but with subtle variations that Vader had never encountered. Most disturbing of all, this presence felt deliberately placed, as if someone wanted him to sense it. Vader's investigation of the depot revealed what appeared to be evidence of rebel infiltration. Security recordings showed gaps that suggested sophisticated slicing techniques. Several shipments of advanced weaponry had been rerouted to destinations that intelligence couldn't verify. Most telling of all, a computer terminal displayed research files about historical Sith artifacts, searches that had been conducted with Imperial clearance codes that should have been impossible to fake. But Vader was no fool. His years of hunting Jedi survivors had taught him to recognize deception in all its forms. This felt too clean, too obvious. Someone wanted him to believe the rebels had gained access to Sith knowledge, but the real question was why. Over the following weeks, similar incidents occurred across Imperial space. Supply lines were disrupted with surgical precision. Officers disappeared from secure facilities, their bodies later discovered arranged in patterns that resembled ancient Sith ritual sites. Most unsettling of all, survivors of these attacks reported seeing a figure in dark robes whose lightsaber technique seemed to blend traditional Sith forms with innovations that shouldn't have existed. Vader threw himself into the investigation with an intensity that worried even Emperor Palpatine. The Dark Lord of the Sith commandeered entire fleets to pursue leads, interrogated prisoners with a brutality that shocked even hardened Imperial officers, and spent hours in meditation trying to identify the source of the disturbance he felt in the Force. It was during one of these meditation sessions that Vader experienced his first direct contact with his hunter. As he sat in his private chambers aboard his Star Destroyer, reaching out through the Force to track his elusive enemy, he suddenly felt a presence touch his mind. Not violently, as a Jedi might attempt, but with a subtle, almost gentle intrusion that felt disturbingly familiar. The mental contact lasted only seconds, but in that time, Vader experienced something he hadn't felt in decades: uncertainty. The presence that touched his mind carried echoes of his own master's dark power, but filtered through a consciousness that felt younger, hungrier, and utterly without the restraints that even Sith Lords usually maintained. When the contact ended, Vader found a message burned into the metal wall of his meditation chamber. Letters formed. This was no longer about investigating rebel activities or tracking down surviving Jedi. This was personal, directed specifically at him, and carried implications that made even Vader's artificial breathing system stutter with something approaching anxiety. Vader immediately contacted Emperor Palpatine, requesting a private audience. In the Emperor's throne room, with its vast windows overlooking the endless cityscape of Coruscant, Master and apprentice discussed this new threat. "You seem troubled, Lord Vader," Palpatine observed, his voice carrying its usual blend of paternal concern and barely concealed amusement. "There is a disturbance in the Force, my master," Vader replied, his mechanical breathing the only sound echoing in the vast chamber. "Someone with knowledge of Sith techniques has been targeting Imperial operations. Their methods suggest training that should be impossible for any surviving Jedi." Palpatine's expression remained neutral, but Vader's enhanced senses detected the slightest acceleration in his master's heartbeat, a micro-expression of satisfaction that lasted barely a fraction of a second. "Intriguing," the Emperor mused. "Perhaps a former Jedi has turned to the dark side. It would not be the first time that those who once served the light have discovered the superiority of Sith philosophy." "Perhaps," Vader agreed, but something in his master's tone set off warning signals that he couldn't quite identify. "I request permission to increase security around critical Imperial installations. This enemy displays tactical knowledge that suggests inside information." "Granted, my friend. But be cautious. Pride has been the downfall of many Sith Lords. Do not assume that your experience makes you invulnerable." As Vader left the throne room, he missed the smile that played across Emperor Palpatine's lips, an expression of anticipation that would have sent chills through anyone who witnessed it. Hunting continued for several more weeks, with Venator always staying one step ahead of Vader's increasingly desperate searches. Each encounter left more evidence of the mysterious Sith's power. Lightsaber burns cut with techniques that predated the Jedi Order, Force signatures that seemed to shift and change like smoke, and most disturbing of all, tactical decisions that seemed to anticipate Vader's responses with unsettling accuracy. Finally, Venator decided it was time for a face-to-face meeting. He chose his location carefully, the ruins of an ancient Jedi temple on the planet Jedha, a world that had been strip-mined for kyber crystals, but still retained enough Force resonance to amplify Sith powers. Venator sent Vader a message through channels that should have been impossible to access, Imperial emergency frequencies that required the highest security clearances. The message was brief: The temple ruins at dawn. Come alone or face the consequences of cowardice. Vader's rage at receiving such a challenge was exceeded only by his curiosity about an enemy who could slice Imperial communications with such ease. He traveled to Jedha in his personal fighter, bringing no backup, no reinforcements, nothing but his lightsaber, and a burning desire to end this game once and for all. The temple ruins were exactly as Venator had promised. Ancient stone structures, partially destroyed by Imperial mining operations, their broken walls and collapsed chambers creating a maze of shadows and hiding places. As Vader's ship touched down on the landing pad, he immediately sensed his enemy's presence, no longer hidden, but projected with deliberate intensity. Venator waited in the temple's central chamber, a circular room whose walls were covered with faded murals depicting the eternal struggle between light and dark. He stood with his back to the entrance, his black robes identical to those worn by Sith Lords throughout history, his lightsaber unlit, but held in a grip that suggested perfect readiness. When Vader entered the chamber, his breathing echoed off the ancient stones like the mechanical heartbeat of some vast machine. The two Sith Lords faced each other across a space that had once hosted countless meditations on the nature of the Force. At last, Venator said, turning to face his legendary opponent. His face was young, unmarked by the scars that defined so many Sith, but his yellow eyes burned with an intensity that made even Vader pause. The great Darth Vader, terror of the galaxy, chosen one of prophecy. I must admit, you're exactly as imposing as the stories suggest. Vader's breathing grew heavier as he studied his enemy. The young man before him radiated dark side energy like a furnace, but there was something else, something that tickled the edges of recognition without quite forming into conscious awareness. You have interfered with Imperial operations for the last time, Vader declared, his voice carrying the mechanical authority that had intimidated countless enemies. Surrender now, and your death will be swift. Venator laughed, a sound that carried genuine amusement rather than the bitter mockery that usually characterized Sith humor. Surrender? My dear Vader, I think you misunderstand the situation. I am not your enemy because I oppose the Empire. I am your enemy because the Empire deserves better than a broken machine pretending to be a Sith Lord. The insult hit deeper than Venator could have known. Vader's memories of his duel with Obi-Wan, of waking up in the mechanical body that had defined his existence ever since, flared with painful intensity. His lightsaber ignited with a snap hiss that seemed to fill the entire chamber. You know nothing of power, Vader growled, raising his crimson blade into a guard position that had served him well in 1,000 battles. I know that you were stronger before you lost your limbs, Venator replied, igniting his own lightsaber. The blade was the same deep red as Vader's, but somehow seemed to burn brighter, as if fed by a more intense connection to the dark side. I know that you've grown comfortable in your position as the Emperor's attack dog. And I know that your recent encounters with young Skywalker have awakened doubts that make you weak. The mention of Luke Skywalker sent a jolt through Vader that was part rage, part something else he refused to acknowledge. How could this stranger know about his son? How could he know about the internal conflicts that Vader himself barely admitted existed? Who are you? Vader demanded, his lightsaber held steady despite the emotional turmoil raging through his mind. Venator smiled, and in that expression, Vader finally saw the resemblance he had been unconsciously noting throughout their encounter. The shape of the eyes, the way the lips curved with cruel amusement, the tilt of the head that suggested aristocratic confidence, all were subtle echoes of a face Vader knew better than any other. I am what you could have been, Venator said, beginning to circle his opponent with the fluid grace of a predator. I am what the Emperor always wanted in an apprentice. I am his son, Lord Vader, and I am here to claim my birthright, the revelation, hit Vader like a physical blow. Emperor Palpatine had a son, a blood heir trained in Sith techniques, and Vader had never known. Worse, the implications were clear. This had always been the plan. Vader was not the chosen successor, merely a placeholder, until the true heir came of age. "Impossible," Vader said, but his voice carried uncertainty for the first time in years. "Is it?" Venator asked, his lightsaber weaving complex patterns in the air as he warmed up for battle. "Did you truly believe that a man like Palpatine would stake his entire legacy on a former Jedi? Did you think your betrayal of the light made you irreplaceable?" The psychological assault was as devastating as any physical attack could have been. Vader's connection to the dark side fed on negative emotions, but this level of personal betrayal threatened to overwhelm even his considerable mental defenses. For a moment, his lightsaber wavered as decades of loyalty and service were recontextualized as elaborate manipulation. Venator pressed his advantage, not with his blade, but with words calculated to cut deeper than any weapon. "He told me everything, Vader. How you begged him to save Padme, how you slaughtered children in your desperation, how you lost to a Jedi Master you should have easily defeated because your anger made you sloppy. You are not a Sith Lord, Vader. You are a cautionary tale." Vader's response came not in words, but in action. He launched himself across the chamber with force-enhanced speed, his lightsaber cutting through the air in a strike designed to end the fight in a single blow. But Venator was ready, his own blade intercepting Vader's with a clash that sent sparks cascading across the ancient stone floor. The duel that followed was unlike anything either combatant had ever experienced. Vader fought with the fury of 20 years of suppressed doubt and rage, his mechanical limbs allowing him to strike with tireless precision. But Venator matched him, move for move, his younger body and uninjured nervous system giving him advantages. That became more apparent as the battle continued. More troubling still was Venator's fighting style. He used traditional Sith lightsaber forms, but adapted them with innovations that seemed to anticipate and counter Vader's techniques. Every defensive position Vader took was met with attacks from angles he hadn't expected. Every offensive sequence was parried with defenses that seemed custom-designed to frustrate his approach. "Did you think your fighting style was secret?" Venator asked as their blades locked in a contest of strength that neither could win. "Father has recordings of every duel you fought, every technique you've mastered. I have studied your methods since childhood." Venator's blade work was a masterclass in Sith combat philosophy. He employed Form 7, Varpad, but modified it with elements drawn from ancient Sith holocrons that predated the Rule of Two. His movements flowed like liquid darkness, each strike connected to the next in sequences that seemed to bend the laws of physics. Where traditional lightsaber combat relied on discrete attacks and defenses, Venator's style created continuous streams of aggression that forced his opponent to react. Rather than act, the younger Sith's innovations went beyond mere technique. He had learned to channel his force sensitivity through his lightsaber in ways that amplified each strike's power without broadcasting his intentions. When his crimson blade met Vader's, the impact carried not just kinetic energy, but concentrated malevolence that sought to disrupt his opponent's connection to the Force. It was psychological warfare conducted through swordplay, each parry designed to plant seeds of doubt and fear. Vader found himself fighting not just a physical opponent, but a manifestation of everything he had feared about his position in the Sith hierarchy. Venator represented youth, where Vader felt age, innovation where he relied on experience, and most crucially, the certainty of belonging where Vader had always harbored doubts about his worthiness. These psychological pressures manifested in his combat performance as micro-hesitations, fractional delays in his responses that a less skilled opponent might never have noticed, but that Venator exploited with surgical precision. The temple chamber became a battlefield where ancient stones bore witness to techniques that had been thought lost to history. Venator demonstrated the Sith ability to phase his lightsaber blade through solid matter for brief moments, allowing him to bypass Vader's guards in ways that violated conventional understanding of lightsaber physics. When Vader raised his weapon to block a high strike, Venator's blade would flicker through the defensive position and solidify just long enough to score hits against his opponent's armor. "You fight like the Jedi taught you," Venator observed as he pressed a particularly complex attack sequence that forced Vader to give ground. All structure, all predictable responses. The Sith way is chaos, adaptation, the willingness to break every rule if it serves your purpose. To demonstrate his point, Venator began incorporating elements into his lightsaber work that no traditional training would have included. He used the Force to accelerate his blade beyond what his physical movements should have allowed, creating multiple afterimages that made it impossible to track the weapon's true position. He employed telekinetic manipulation of dust and debris to create visual obstacles that obscured his attacks. Most unsettling of all, he began to modulate his lightsaber's energy output mid-strike, causing the blade's length to fluctuate in patterns designed to confuse his opponent's defensive calculations. Vader's response to these innovations was to reach deeper into his own understanding of combat, drawing upon experiences that stretched back to his days as Anakin Skywalker. As a Jedi, he had been considered one of the most naturally gifted duelists of his generation, with an intuitive understanding of lightsaber combat that complemented his exceptional Force sensitivity. But as Darth Vader, he had suppressed many of these abilities in favor of the more brutal, direct approaches favored by Sith philosophy. Now, facing an opponent who combined Sith ruthlessness with innovative technique, Vader began to integrate elements of his former Jedi training with his current dark side mastery. The result was a fighting style that neither combatant had anticipated. Fluid and creative like a Jedi's approach, but powered by the raw emotion and aggression that defined Sith combat. The change was immediately apparent to Venator, whose carefully planned counters suddenly became less effective. Where he had expected predictable Sith responses, he found himself facing techniques that drew from a broader range of combat philosophies. Vader's blade work began to incorporate elements of Ataru, the aggressive Jedi form that emphasized acrobatic movements and rapid strikes, but modified to take advantage of his mechanical limbs' enhanced strength and durability. "Interesting," Venator acknowledged as he found himself forced to abandon a prepared attack sequence when Vader's response didn't match his expectations. So the machine remembers something of the man he used to be, but memories of the light cannot overcome the reality of darkness. The psychological aspect of their duel intensified as both combatants began to understand that they were fighting not just for victory, but for the right to define what it meant to be a true Sith Lord. Venator represented the future of the Sith philosophy. Young, innovative, unrestrained by the failures and compromises that had shaped previous generations. Vader embodied the culmination of centuries of Sith tradition, powerful, experienced, tempered by suffering into a weapon of absolute efficiency. Their lightsabers painted arcs of crimson light across the temple walls as the duel moved through the ancient chamber. Each strike left scorch marks on stones that had stood for millennia, and the Force energies unleashed by their combat began to resonate with the temple's own accumulated spiritual power. The very air seemed to thicken with dark side energy, as both Sith Lords drew more deeply upon their connection to the malevolent aspects of the Force. Venator's next innovation was perhaps his most dangerous. He began to fight with two lightsabers, using the Force to maintain perfect coordination between weapons held in each hand. The second blade materialized from within his robes, its crimson glow identical to the first, but its combat applications dramatically different. Where his primary lightsaber continued to engage Vader's weapon directly, the secondary blade wove complex patterns designed to exploit openings in his opponent's defense. The dual blade technique should have been devastating against any conventional opponent, but Vader's mechanical nature provided unexpected advantages. His artificial limbs could track and respond to multiple threats with precision that organic reflexes couldn't match, and his enhanced sensory systems allowed him to monitor both weapons simultaneously without the divided attention that would have hindered a purely biological fighter. More importantly, the sight of dual lightsabers triggered memories that Vader had thought permanently suppressed. He remembered facing General Grievous during the Clone Wars, a mechanical opponent who wielded multiple lightsabers with inhuman coordination. The techniques he had developed to counter that threat, refined through countless battles against droid opponents, suddenly became relevant again. Vader's response was to modify his single-blade technique to create the illusion of multiple weapons. Using precise force manipulation, he began to control his lightsaber's position with such speed and accuracy that it seemed to be in multiple places simultaneously. His blade created defensive screens that appeared solid, but were actually composed of rapid movements too fast for biological perception to track. "You adapt quickly for an old machine," Venator admitted as his dual-blade assault failed to penetrate Vader's defenses. But adaptation has limits. Evolution requires the willingness to discard what no longer serves. As if to prove his point, Venator suddenly abandoned his secondary lightsaber, allowing it to deactivate and fall to the temple floor. But instead of returning to single-blade combat, he began to fight without any weapon at all, using pure force manipulation to create cutting edges of compressed energy that functioned like invisible lightsaber blades. The technique was so advanced that even Vader, with all his experience and training, took several moments to understand what he was facing. Venator's hands moved in complex patterns that generated force constructs, capable of parrying lightsaber strikes and delivering cutting attacks with lethality equal to any physical weapon. It was lightsaber combat elevated to an art form that transcended the need for actual lightsabers. The strategy was agonizing and dangerous, as each successful strike from Venator's force constructs sent feedback through Vader's nervous system that his mechanical life support could barely compensate for. But it also provided him with the information he needed to understand how these invisible weapons functioned, how they interfaced with the Force, and most importantly, how they could be disrupted. When Vader's counterattack came, it was not with his lightsaber, but with a force technique so brutal and direct that it overwhelmed Venator's sophisticated constructs through sheer power. Instead of trying to match his opponent's innovation with equal creativity, Vader simply flooded the space between them with concentrated dark side energy, creating a field of malevolent force power so intense that it disrupted all subtle force manipulations within its range. Venator's invisible weapons collapsed immediately, their delicate energy matrices unable to maintain coherence in the face of Vader's psychic assault. The younger Sith found himself suddenly defenseless, his most advanced techniques rendered useless by an approach that favored raw power over technical sophistication. "Innovation," Vader said as he pressed his advantage with renewed lightsaber. "Attacks is meaningless without the strength to sustain it." The tide of battle had turned dramatically, but Venator was far from defeated. Drawing upon reserves of dark side power that he had been carefully husbanding throughout their duel, he began to employ techniques that pushed the boundaries of what the Force could accomplish. The air around him began. Vader's mechanical components, designed to operate in the vacuum of space and the extreme environments of industrial facilities, provided some protection against the thermal assault. But even his advanced systems had limits, and warning alarms began to sound inside his helmet as exterior temperatures reached levels that threatened critical components. The temple chamber became a furnace as Venator's heat manipulation created updrafts that sent ancient dust and debris swirling through the air. The very stones began to glow cherry red in places where the thermal effects were most concentrated, and the metallic components of both combatants' equipment started to expand and contract in ways that affected their performance. You want to see the future of Sith power? Venator demanded as he intensified his thermal assault. This is what happens when someone fully embraces the potential of the dark side, without the limitations imposed by outdated traditions and mechanical dependencies. But Vader had faced environmental hazards far worse than mere heat during his years as a Sith Lord. His mechanical nature, which Venator saw as a weakness, had actually prepared him for combat in conditions that would have been lethal to purely organic opponents. As the temperature in the temple chamber soared toward levels that would have killed any normal being, Vader began to implement countermeasures that drew upon his unique nature, using the Force to interface directly with his own mechanical systems. Vader began to reroute power and coolant flows in ways that his original designers had never intended. His life support systems became weapons, venting superheated gases and coolant fluids in precisely controlled bursts that disrupted Venator's thermal manipulation while creating momentary openings for attack. More importantly, Vader began to use his own mechanical heat generation as a weapon, overcharging his systems to create thermal signatures that confused and disrupted Venator's environmental control. The younger Sith, accustomed to being the only source of extreme heat in any given battle, suddenly found himself trying to maintain precise temperature control in an environment where multiple heat sources were creating chaotic thermal currents. The duel evolved into a battle of environmental manipulation as much as lightsaber technique, with both combatants using the Force to control temperature, air pressure, and even the local gravitational field within the temple chamber. Ancient stones cracked and crumbled as they were subjected to rapid heating and cooling cycles, while metal components throughout the chamber expanded and contracted beyond their design tolerances. It was during this exchange of environmental attacks that Venator made his first serious tactical error. In his eagerness to demonstrate the superiority of his techniques, he began drawing Force energy, not just from his own reserves, but from the temple itself, tapping into centuries of accumulated spiritual power without fully understanding its nature or composition. The Jedi Temple, even in ruins, retained traces of the light side of the Force that had been cultivated there for generations. When Venator attempted to channel this energy through his dark side techniques, the conflicting Force signatures created an internal resonance that threatened to tear his connection to the Force apart from within. Vader, with his enhanced sensitivity to Force disturbances, immediately recognized what was happening to his opponent. The younger Sith's thermal manipulation began to fluctuate wildly as his control over the Force became erratic and unpredictable. Energy that should have been precisely directed instead scattered in random bursts that were as dangerous to Venator himself as they were to his intended target. Ambitious, Vader observed as he watched his opponent struggle with the conflicting energies coursing through his system. But ambition without wisdom is merely a path to self-destruction. Venator's response was to double down on his dangerous technique, drawing even more deeply from the temple's Force reserves in an attempt to overwhelm the light side contamination through sheer volume of dark side energy. The result was catastrophic. The conflicting Force signatures within his body began to manifest as visible phenomena, creating cracks of light and darkness that ran across his skin like living tattoos. The young Sith's face contorted with pain as the warring energies threatened to consume him from within, but his expression also carried a terrifying determination. If he was going to fall, he intended to take his opponent with him, channeling the unstable Force mixture into one final, devastating attack. "If I cannot claim my birthright," Venator gasped as the energy cracks spread across his body, "then let this temple become our tomb." What followed was less a coherent attack than an explosion of uncontrolled Force energy. The conflicting light and dark side powers within Venator's system reached critical resonance and began to discharge in patterns that defied conventional understanding of how the Force operated. The temple chamber filled with cascading waves of energy that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, creating visual effects that human perception could barely process. Vader, recognizing the signs of an impending force detonation, made a split-second decision that would have surprised anyone who knew his reputation for ruthless pragmatism. Instead of retreating to a safe distance and allowing the explosion to eliminate his opponent, he stepped forward and began to absorb the excess energy into his own mechanical systems. The technique was one of the most advanced applications of Sith power, requiring perfect control over both the Force and one's own physical systems. As the contaminated energy flowed into Vader's cybernetic components, his built-in safeguards began to overload. Warning lights flashed throughout his suit as systems designed to protect him from external threats struggled to cope with internal energy discharges that exceeded all design parameters. But Vader's mechanical nature, which had been a liability during much of their duel, finally became an advantage. Where an organic being would have been consumed instantly by the conflicting force energies, his artificial components could be sacrificed to contain and channel the deadly power. Non-essential systems throughout his suit began to shut down as he deliberately rerouted the dangerous energy into components that could be replaced if he survived the ordeal. The absorption process was excruciating, as the conflicting light and dark side energies created feedback loops that interfaced directly with his nervous system. Every circuit that overloaded sent cascades of pain through his organic brain, while his breathing apparatus struggled to maintain life support functions as power was diverted to contain the Force explosion. Yet Vader endured, his lifetime of suffering having prepared him for pain that would have driven lesser beings to madness. Through willpower alone, he maintained the energy absorption until Venator's system finally stabilized. The dangerous resonance dampened to manageable levels by its transfer into Vader's more robust mechanical framework. When the process was complete, Venator collapsed to the temple floor, alive but completely drained of Force energy. His skin bore permanent scars where the conflicting powers had battled within his system, creating patterns that seemed to shift and move in the chamber's dim light. He was no longer the confident young Sith who had challenged the galaxy's most feared enforcer. He was a broken remnant, his connection to the Force damaged perhaps beyond repair. Vader stood over his fallen opponent, his own systems barely functional after absorbing energies that should have killed them both. Steam vented from damaged components throughout his suit, and several of his secondary life support systems had shut down entirely. But he was alive, and more importantly, he was victorious. "Why?" Venator whispered, his voice barely audible in the suddenly quiet chamber. "You could have let me die. It would have been easier, safer. Why risk yourself to save me?" The question hung in the air between them, carrying implications that extended far beyond their personal conflict. In that moment, Vader faced a choice that would define not just the outcome of their duel, but his understanding of what it meant to be a Sith Lord. Traditional Sith philosophy would have demanded that he finish his defeated opponent, claiming complete victory and eliminating any future threat. The rule of two itself suggested that only through the death of rivals could a Sith Lord prove his worthiness. Every instinct cultivated through 20 years of dark side training urged him to ignite his lightsaber and end Venator's life. But something else stirred within Vader's consciousness, a recognition of shared experience that transcended their rivalry. Both of them were products of Palpatine's manipulation, weapons forged by a master who viewed them as expendable tools rather than sentient beings deserving of respect or loyalty. In Venator's defeat, Vader saw a reflection of his own position. Powerful yet ultimately powerless, feared yet ultimately pitied. "Because," Vader said slowly, his mechanical breathing filling the silence as he formulated thoughts he had never expected to voice. "We are both victims of the same manipulator. The Emperor created you to replace me, just as he used me to replace his previous apprentices. We are not enemies by choice, but by design. The admission carried weight that neither of them had anticipated. For the first time in their relationship, master and apprentice were speaking to each other as equals rather than as predator and prey. The artificial hierarchy imposed by their training and circumstances had been stripped away. "He told me I was his heir," Venator said, his voice carrying the confusion of a child whose fundamental beliefs have been shattered. "He said I would rule the galaxy at his side, that the Sith bloodline would continue through me. Was none of it true?" Vader's response was measured, informed by decades of experience with Palpatine's deceptions. Some of it, perhaps. But the Emperor's truth is always constructed to serve his purposes. He told you what you needed to hear to become the weapon he required, just as he did with me. The conversation that followed was unlike any exchange that had ever taken place between Sith Lords. Instead of the usual posturing and threats, master and apprentice found themselves engaged in something approaching honest communication. Vader shared insights drawn from his years of service to Palpatine, while Venator described training techniques and philosophical approaches that had been hidden even from the Emperor's primary apprentice. As they spoke, both began to understand the true scope of Palpatine's manipulation. The Emperor had not simply been playing them against each other. He had been conducting a complex psychological experiment designed to optimize the performance of his enforcement apparatus. Every choice they had made, every technique they had developed, every relationship they had formed or abandoned had been guided by influences they had never recognized. "The question," Vader said as their conversation drew toward its inevitable conclusion, "is what we choose to do with this knowledge. We can continue to serve a master who views us as expendable, or we can consider alternatives." The offer of alliance that had been implicit in their earlier exchange became explicit, carrying possibilities that neither had seriously considered when their duel began. Together, they possessed intimate knowledge of Imperial operations, command, authority that extended throughout the galaxy, and most importantly, personal motivations that aligned against their common manipulator. For a moment, it seemed as though the course of galactic history might pivot on the choice these two broken beings made in the ruins of an ancient temple. An alliance between Vader and Venator could threaten Palpatine's reign in ways that no external enemy ever could. They understood his methods, his weaknesses, his deepest fears and desires. More crucially, they had been shaped by his training into weapons capable of matching his power. But the moment of possibility passed as quickly as it had come. Venator's conditioning, refined through years of careful indoctrination, proved stronger than his newfound understanding of their situation. The concept of betraying his father, even after learning the extent of his manipulation, lay beyond the psychological barriers that had been constructed around his loyalty. "I cannot," he said finally, his voice carrying genuine regret but unshakable resolve. "Whatever his methods, whatever his true feelings toward me, he is my father and my master. The bond of blood and teaching cannot be severed by mere disillusionment." Vader nodded slowly, understanding the choice even as he recognized its tragedy. The younger Sith's loyalty was not based on rational calculation or mutual benefit, but on emotional connections that had been deliberately cultivated to ensure exactly this outcome. Palpatine had created in his son not just a weapon, but a weapon that could never be turned against its creator. "Then this ends as it must," Vader replied, raising his lightsaber with the mechanical precision that had defined countless similar moments throughout his career. But Venator raised a hand to forestall the killing blow, his exhausted features carrying an expression of unexpected peace. "Wait. If you must report my death to the Emperor, tell him that I died worthy of the Palpatine name. Let him know that his son proved himself in combat against the galaxy's most feared warrior." The request carried poignant implications about the nature of family relationships within the Sith hierarchy. Even knowing that his father had engineered his destruction, Venator still sought approval and recognition. The need for paternal validation transcended even the certainty of betrayal, revealing depths of psychological conditioning that Vader found both familiar and disturbing. "I will convey your words," Vader promised. And in that moment, both combatants understood that their conflict had transformed into something approaching friendship. They were no longer master and apprentice, hunter and prey, but fellow victims, recognizing their shared circumstances. The final exchange was brief and merciful. Vader's lightsaber ended Venator's life with surgical precision, avoiding unnecessary pain or suffering. As the younger Sith's body settled into the ancient temple floor, his expression carried not defeat but something resembling satisfaction. He had proven himself in combat, earned his opponent's respect, and died with dignity intact. Vader stood alone in the ruined chamber, surrounded by broken stones and ancient texts that had witnessed the end of Emperor Palpatine's secret heir. The silence that followed was profound, carrying weight that extended far beyond their personal conflict. Something fundamental had changed in the galaxy's balance of power, though its effects would not be immediately apparent. The journey back to Coruscant gave Vader time to process the implications of what had occurred. His damaged life support systems required constant attention, providing concrete reminders of how close he had come to sharing Venator's fate. But more troubling were the psychological reverberations of their final conversation. Revelations about Palpatine's methods that cast new light on decades of shared history. When he finally stood before the Emperor's throne to deliver his report, Vader's account was carefully constructed to conceal the most dangerous truths while satisfying his master's curiosity. He described a Sith apprentice of exceptional skill and training, someone who had clearly received instruction in techniques that few beings in the galaxy possessed. He reported a fierce battle that had tested his abilities to their limits, emphasizing the threat this enemy had represented to Imperial security. What he did not mention was Venator's true identity, the extent of their philosophical discussions, or the offer of alliance that had briefly united them against their common manipulator. These secrets would remain buried with the young Sith who had carried them, private knowledge that would influence Vader's future choices in ways that Palpatine could never anticipate. "Excellent work, Lord Vader," the Emperor said when the report concluded, his voice carrying its usual blend of satisfaction and underlying calculation. "This enemy clearly possessed dangerous knowledge and abilities. The Empire is safer with the threat eliminated." But as he spoke these words of praise, Palpatine's yellow eyes studied his apprentice with an intensity that suggested deeper currents of thought. Had Vader discovered the truth about his opponent's identity? Did he suspect the larger game that had been played? The Sith Master's expression revealed nothing, but his mind was already calculating the implications of various possibilities. For his part, Vader maintained the emotionless facade that had served him well through decades of service. His mechanical breathing filled the throne room with its familiar rhythm, while his hidden thoughts remained carefully shielded from his master's attempts at mental intrusion. The skills he had developed to survive in the Imperial hierarchy now served to conceal knowledge that could reshape their relationship. In the days and weeks that followed, both master and apprentice began to adapt to the new reality created by Venator's death. Palpatine mourned the loss of his carefully cultivated heir while simultaneously analyzing what his elimination revealed about Vader's continued usefulness. The older Sith had proven his strength once again, but at what cost? The damage to his mechanical systems had been extensive, requiring repairs that revealed vulnerabilities that could be exploited by future enemies. More concerning were the subtle changes in Vader's behavior that began to manifest in the aftermath of their encounter. His meditation sessions grew longer and more intense, as if he were processing experiences that challenged his fundamental assumptions. His interactions with Imperial officers became more complex, displaying nuances of thought and consideration that had been absent from his previous direct approach to leadership. Most significantly, his pursuit of Luke Skywalker took on different characteristics. Where previously he had hunted his son with the single-minded focus of a predator tracking prey, now his approach showed signs of internal conflict. Intelligence reports suggested that he was creating opportunities for Luke to escape, rather than pressing advantages that could have led to capture. These changes did not escape Palpatine's attention, but their implications remained unclear. Was Vader growing soft, developing emotional attachments that weakened his commitment to the dark side? Or was he becoming more sophisticated in his manipulation techniques, adapting his methods to achieve more complex objectives? The Emperor's attempts to probe his apprentice's thoughts met with defenses that seemed stronger than before, suggesting that whatever had occurred during the confrontation with the mysterious Sith had changed Vader in fundamental ways. The truth was more complex than either interpretation suggested. Vader's encounter with Venator had awakened aspects of his consciousness that had been dormant since his transformation into a Sith Lord. The younger man's loyalty to Palpatine, despite clear evidence of betrayal, had forced Vader to examine his own relationships and motivations with uncomfortable honesty. For the first time in decades, Vader began to consider the possibility that loyalty based on manipulation was fundamentally different from loyalty based on genuine respect or affection. Venator's tragic devotion to a father who saw him as expendable had illuminated the pathological nature of all relationships within the Sith hierarchy, including his own connection to Palpatine. This realization did not immediately translate into rebellion or defiance. Vader's conditioning was too complete, his fear of his master too deeply ingrained for such direct responses. Instead, the knowledge worked more subtly, creating space for thoughts and considerations that had previously been impossible. When reports reached him of Luke Skywalker's activities with the Rebel Alliance, Vader found himself analyzing these developments through new frameworks. His son's choices, viewed through the lens of his conversation with Venator, revealed patterns of genuine loyalty and selfless commitment that stood in stark contrast to the manipulative relationships that defined Imperial hierarchy. The contrast was both enlightening and disturbing. Luke fought alongside beings who valued his life and well-being for their own sake, not because of what he could provide for them. His friends in the Alliance risked their safety to protect him, expected nothing but friendship in return, and seemed to genuinely care about his moral and spiritual development. This type of relationship was so foreign to Vader's experience that he initially struggled to understand its implications. But as time passed and his observations continued, Vader began to recognize something that Venator's death had made possible: the existence of alternatives to the power-based relationships that had defined his entire adult life. The possibility that strength could coexist with compassion, that loyalty could exist without coercion, that family bonds could be based on love rather than utility. These revelations created internal pressures that Vader struggled to contain. His mechanical nature, which had previously provided emotional stability through its very limitations, now seemed like a prison that prevented him from fully exploring these new possibilities. The life support systems that had saved him from death began to feel like barriers that separated him from the more complex emotional experiences he was beginning to crave. It was during this period of internal transformation that the events leading to the Battle of Endor began to unfold. When Emperor Palpatine revealed his plan to use Luke Skywalker as bait to destroy the Rebel Alliance, Vader's response was shaped by insights that would have been impossible without his earlier confrontation with the Emperor's son. Palpatine's strategy was elegant in its cruelty. Allow Luke to learn of the second Death Star's location, permit the Rebel Alliance to mount what they believed was a surprise attack, then use their son's presence to force Vader to eliminate the Alliance's leadership while demonstrating the Empire's invincibility. It was manipulation on a galactic scale, using family bonds as weapons in service of political objectives. But where once Vader might have accepted this plan without question, his understanding of Palpatine's methods now allowed him to see the deeper implications. The Emperor was not just using Luke as bait for the rebels, he was using both Luke and Vader as test subjects in another psychological experiment. The confrontation between father and son would reveal information about both that Palpatine could use to optimize his control over whichever survived. This realization should have filled Vader with the familiar rage that had powered his dark side abilities for decades. Instead, he found himself experiencing something new, a cold, analytical anger that was focused not on destruction, but on protection. For the first time since his transformation, his primary motivation was not to serve his master's will, but to shield someone else from the consequences of that service. The internal shift was profound enough to affect his connection to the Force itself. Where previously his power had been fueled by personal suffering and self-directed hatred, now it drew strength from his desire to prevent Luke from experiencing the same manipulation and betrayal that had defined his own relationship with Palpatine. It was still dark side energy, still powered by negative emotions, but its focus had changed from purely selfish concerns to something approaching altruistic purpose. When the final confrontation came aboard the second Death Star, Vader faced the moment armed with knowledge that neither Luke nor Palpatine fully understood. He recognized the psychological pressures being applied to his son, understood the traps being laid through seemingly casual conversation, and most importantly, he saw the larger pattern of manipulation that sought to use their family bond as a weapon against them both. The lightsaber duel between Luke and Vader that followed was informed by these deeper currents of understanding. Where Palpatine expected to see father and son driven against each other by skillfully applied pressure, he instead witnessed something unprecedented, a contest between opponents who were actually communicating rather than simply fighting. Vader's technique during the duel was designed not to kill or even seriously injure his son, but to create opportunities for Luke to understand the true nature of their situation. Each exchange of blows carried coded information about Palpatine's methods, about the psychological traps being laid, about the importance of making choices based on genuine conviction rather than emotional manipulation. Luke, for his part, sensed these deeper communications without fully understanding their implications. His connection to the light side of the Force allowed him to perceive his father's internal conflict, but the complexity of Vader's motivations remained largely hidden. What he could sense was that their combat was serving purposes beyond simple victory or defeat. When the moment came for Luke to choose between striking down his father or accepting his own death, his decision was informed by perceptions that went beyond the immediate tactical situation. He sensed not just Vader's conflict, but something approaching hope. The possibility that even the darkest soul could find redemption if offered genuine love and acceptance. Vader's response to his son's mercy was shaped by insights that stretched back to his conversation with Venator in the ruins of the Jedi Temple. He had seen what loyalty based on manipulation ultimately produced. Tragic devotion that served the manipulator's purposes even when it led to the devoted's destruction. Luke's refusal to follow that pattern, his willingness to die rather than participate in the cycle of betrayal that defined Sith relationships, represented something genuinely new in Vader's experience. When Emperor Palpatine began his attempt to kill Luke with Force lightning, Vader faced the choice that had been building since Venator's death. He could continue to serve a master who viewed all relationships as tools for manipulation, or he could act on the understanding that some bonds transcended utility and deserved protection for their own sake. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable rather than heroic. Vader's intervention was not a dramatic change of heart, but the culmination of a process that had begun when he chose to save rather than destroy his opponent in the ruins of Jedha. He had learned to recognize the difference between loyalty based on manipulation and loyalty based on love. And when forced to choose between them, his choice was clear. Emperor Palpatine's death, when it came, was as much the result of his own psychological methods as it was of Vader's physical action. The Sith Master had created in his apprentice a weapon so perfectly attuned to recognizing and resisting manipulation that it inevitably turned against the manipulator himself. His downfall was not a failure of technique or preparation, but the logical consequence of relationships based entirely on the exploitation of others. In his final moments, as the electrical damage from Palpatine's lightning overwhelmed his life support systems, Vader reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. Venator's death had been the catalyst for a process of understanding that made redemption possible. But the younger Sith's sacrifice had served a purpose that neither of them could have anticipated during their duel. The secret son, who had been trained to hunt Darth Vader, had instead provided him with the insights necessary to recognize true loyalty when he encountered it. The confrontation that was meant to eliminate a threat to Palpatine's power had instead created the conditions that made the Emperor's eventual defeat inevitable. In trying to optimize his control through manipulation and betrayal, the Sith Master had planted the seeds of his own destruction. As Luke cradled his dying father, both understood that their relationship had been shaped by forces and choices that extended far beyond their personal experience. The love that existed between them was real and powerful, but it had been made possible by lessons learned through conflict, betrayal, and ultimately the recognition that some things were worth protecting regardless of personal cost. Vader's final words to his son carried the weight of everything he had learned from his encounter with Palpatine's other heir. "Tell your sister, you were right about me." It was not just an acknowledgement of Luke's faith in his redemption, but a recognition that love based on hope rather than manipulation had proven stronger than all the Emperor's psychological weapons. In the end, the galaxy was saved not just by Luke Skywalker's heroism or Vader's sacrifice, but by the understanding that both had gained through their various encounters with the complex legacy of Palpatine's manipulative philosophy. The secret son, who had been raised to embody that philosophy's perfection, had instead revealed its fundamental weakness, creating the possibility for relationships based on genuine care rather than mutual exploitation. The hunting that had begun with hatred and rivalry had ended with redemption and hope, proving that even in the darkest corners of the galaxy, the capacity for growth and change could never be completely eliminated. Venator's death had not been in vain. It had been the first step in a process that would ultimately restore balance to the Force and bring peace to a war-torn galaxy. Vader disengaged and tried a different approach, using the Force to lift chunks of rubble from the damaged temple walls. Venator countered by creating a barrier of dark-side energy that not only deflected the debris, but sent it back with increased velocity. Vader was forced to deflect his own attacks, putting him immediately on the defensive. "You relied too heavily on brute force," Venator observed, pressing his lightsaber advantage while Vader was distracted by the flying stones. "It worked against Jedi who were restrained by their philosophy, but Sith fight differently. We embrace chaos, turn it to our advantage." As if to demonstrate his point, Venator began incorporating Force lightning into his swordplay, not in discrete bursts, but as a constant enhancement to his movements. His lightsaber seemed to crackle with additional energy, and when it made contact with Vader's blade, electrical discharges ran down the weapon toward its wielder. Vader's mechanical components, usually an advantage in their resistance to pain, became a liability as the electrical attacks interfaced with his systems. Warning alarms began chiming inside his helmet as circuits struggled to cope with the Sith lightning. His breathing became more labored as his life support systems diverted power to protective protocols. Even your greatest strength becomes weakness. When facing a true Sith, Venator taunted, increasing the intensity of his electrical attacks. Those machines that keep you alive make you vulnerable to the most basic of dark side techniques. But Vader was not the chosen one because of his mechanical parts. Beneath the armor and artificial limbs, the Force flowed through him with a power that few beings in galactic history had ever possessed. As Venator's lightning coursed through his systems, Vader reached deeper into the dark side than he had in years. The response was immediate and terrifying. Vader's pain, his rage at this betrayal, his fear of being replaced, and his desperate need to prove his worth all combined into a Force signature so intense that it made the ancient temple stones crack. When he struck back, his lightsaber moved with speed that even Venator's enhanced reflexes could barely track. The tide of battle shifted dramatically. Where Venator had been controlling the engagement, now he found himself giving ground. His innovative techniques struggling to cope with the sheer power Vader was bringing to bear. This was why Anakin Skywalker had been the chosen one, why even diminished he remained one of the most feared beings in the galaxy. Venator's confidence began to crack as he realized that his father's intelligence files, comprehensive as they were, had underestimated the depths of power available to Vader when properly motivated. The older Sith's attacks came not just with mechanical precision, but with the fury of someone fighting for his very existence. Impressive, Venator gasped as he parried a strike that sent vibrations up his arms, strong enough to numb his fingers. Father was right about your potential, but potential unused is merely waste. Vader's response was to increase his assault, his lightsaber becoming a crimson blur that forced Venator to abandon offense entirely. The younger Sith found himself backed against one of the temple walls, his breathing becoming labored as he struggled to maintain defenses against Vader's relentless attack. It was then that Venator made his crucial mistake. Seeing an apparent opening in Vader's guard, he attempted a killing thrust aimed at the chest plate that housed many of Vader's vital systems. But the opening was deliberate, a trap that Vader had been preparing throughout their entire duel. As Venator committed to his attack, Vader sidestepped with mechanical precision and brought his lightsaber down in an arc that should have ended the fight. But Venator's reflexes, honed by years of training, allowed him to twist away at the last second. Instead of a killing blow, Vader's lightsaber carved a deep gouge across Venator's shoulder, sending him stumbling backward with a cry of pain and rage. The wound was serious, but not fatal, and it served to remind Venator that he was fighting for his life against one of the galaxy's most dangerous beings. His earlier confidence had been replaced by a cold realization that victory was far from certain. "You fight well for a broken machine," Venator admitted, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side while he switched his lightsaber to his uninjured hand. "But I have resources you cannot imagine." What happened next violated several natural laws and suggested that Venator's training had included techniques that even Vader had never encountered. The injured Sith Lord began to draw Force energy not just from his own reserves, but from the ancient temple itself, tapping into centuries of accumulated spiritual power that had soaked into the very stones. The temple began to glow with an eerie light as Venator channeled this energy into his wounded body. Before Vader's eyes, the lightsaber wound began to close, muscle and sinew re-knitting themselves with unnatural speed. Within moments, Venator was standing upright again, his lightsaber held in both hands, his yellow eyes now literally blazing with power. "Sith alchemy," he explained, noting Vader's surprise. "One of many techniques Father taught me that he never shared with you. Did you truly believe that your training was complete?" The renewed battle was even more intense than their first encounter. Venator, healed and energized by the Force power he had absorbed, fought with techniques that seemed to bend the laws of physics. His lightsaber left trails of energy that persisted for seconds after each strike, creating barriers of crackling power that Vader had to navigate while defending against conventional attacks. More disturbing still was the way Venator seemed to be growing stronger as the fight continued. Each exchange of blows left him more energized, while Vader's mechanical systems began showing signs of strain. Warning lights flashed inside his helmet as backup systems activated to compensate for damaged components. "Do you understand now?" Venator asked as he pressed his renewed assault. "This was never a test of strength. This was a demonstration. Father wanted you to see what a true Sith heir looks like before you die." But Vader had spent too many years as a Sith Lord to be intimidated by superior technique or greater raw power. His strength had never been in his lightsaber skills or his Force abilities alone, but in his refusal to surrender, his willingness to endure any amount of pain or suffering to achieve victory. As Venator's attacks forced him back across the temple chamber, Vader began to implement a strategy that would have horrified his former Jedi masters. He started deliberately, damaging his own life support systems, allowing pain and the fear of death to flow through him without resistance. Instead of fighting these negative emotions, he embraced them, used them to fuel a connection to the dark side more complete than anything he had experienced since his transformation. The change was immediately apparent to Venator, whose Force senses detected the shift in his opponent's energy signature. Where before Vader had fought with controlled aggression, now he radiated malevolence so pure and concentrated that it made the temple stones crack under the psychic pressure. Vader's next attack came not with his lightsaber, but with the Force itself, a telekinetic assault so powerful that it lifted Venator off his feet and hurled him across the chamber with bone-crushing force. The younger Sith hit the far wall with an impact that sent spiderwebs of cracks radiating outward from the point of collision. As Venator struggled to his feet, blood running from his nose and ears, Vader began to advance with deliberate slowness. His lightsaber was still ignited, but he held it casually at his side, as if the outcome of their duel was already decided. "You spoke of what I could have been," Vader said, his mechanical breathing the only sound in the suddenly silent chamber. "But you fail to understand what I am. I am not the Emperor's apprentice because he chose me. I am his apprentice because I chose to embrace power without limit, to sacrifice everything human in myself for strength. You are still bound by the illusion that you can have power without paying its price." Venator wiped blood from his face and raised his lightsaber in a defensive position. "Pretty words, but they won't save you when Father learns of your weakness. Did you think he wouldn't notice your hesitation when facing Skywalker? Did you think he wouldn't see the conflict in your heart?" The mention of Luke struck deeper than any lightsaber wound could have. Vader's connection to his son was the one part of his humanity that he had never fully suppressed, the single crack in the armor of darkness that protected his soul. That Venator knew about this vulnerability, that he had been instructed to exploit it, suggested a level of manipulation that even Vader found shocking. "The Emperor knows about Luke," Vader realized, the words carrying terrible implications. "He has known all along." Venator smiled through his pain, blood staining his teeth red. "Of course he knows. He has known since the boy destroyed the Death Star. Why do you think he allowed you to continue your ineffective pursuit? Why do you think he hasn't simply had the boy eliminated by Imperial assassins? Because Luke Skywalker serves a purpose. He is the test that will determine whether you remain useful or whether you must be replaced." The psychological manipulation was masterful, designed to shatter the last foundations of trust between Vader and his master. But it also revealed something that Venator had not intended. If the Emperor was testing Vader's loyalty through Luke, then this entire confrontation was part of a larger scheme. Vader was not just fighting for his life. He was performing in a drama whose script had been written by Palpatine. Understanding this changed everything. Vader's rage, previously focused on Venator as a rival and threat, expanded to encompass the Emperor himself. The betrayal was complete. Not only had Palpatine hidden the existence of a blood heir, he had engineered this confrontation as entertainment, a gladiatorial contest to determine which apprentice would serve his purposes more effectively. When Vader attacked again, his assault carried 20 years of accumulated resentment against a master who viewed him as nothing more than a useful tool. His lightsaber work became less mechanical, more creative, incorporating techniques he had learned as Anakin Skywalker, but had suppressed during his years as a Sith Lord. Venator found himself facing not just Darth Vader, but glimpses of the Jedi Knight who had been considered the most naturally gifted swordsman of his generation. The combination of Sith ruthlessness with Jedi innovation created a fighting style that was completely unpredictable, something that no amount of study or preparation could have anticipated. The duel moved throughout the ancient temple as neither combatant could maintain a positional advantage for long. They fought across broken altars and through collapsed archways, their lightsabers carving new scars into stone that had already witnessed millennia of conflict. The Force itself seemed to respond to their battle, causing temperatures to fluctuate wildly and making the air itself crackle with barely contained energy. Finally, in a chamber whose walls were covered with ancient Jedi texts carved into the stone itself, the end came with shocking suddenness. Venator, attempting to channel more power from the temple's Force reservoirs, made the fatal error of drawing too deeply from sources he didn't fully understand. The Jedi Temple, even in ruins, retained enough light side influence to contaminate the energy he was trying to absorb. The result was catastrophic. Light and dark side energies clashed within Venator's body, creating an internal conflict that manifested as visible cracks of energy running across his skin. His connection to the Force became chaotic, uncontrolled, dangerous to himself and everyone around him. Vader, recognizing the signs of impending Force combustion, made a decision that would have surprised anyone who knew him. Instead of stepping back to avoid the explosion, he reached out through the Force and began to drain the excess energy from Venator's body, channeling it into himself despite the obvious danger. The technique was one of the most advanced applications of Sith power, requiring perfect control and absolute fearlessness. As the contaminated Force energy flowed into Vader's mechanical systems, alarms began screaming inside his helmet. His backup life support systems engaged as primary circuits overloaded, but he maintained the drain, drawing the deadly energy away from Venator until the younger Sith collapsed to his knees, alive but completely exhausted. "Why?" Venator gasped, staring up at the imposing figure of Darth Vader with confusion and something approaching respect. "You could have let me die. It would have solved your problem." Vader looked down at the son of his master, this young man who had been trained from birth to replace him, and for a moment his answer surprised even himself. "Because," he said slowly, his mechanical breathing filling the silence, "we are both victims of the same manipulator. The Emperor plays us against each other while he sits safely on his throne, amused by our struggles. Perhaps it is time we considered who our real enemy is." The offer hung in the air between them, a possibility that neither had considered when their duel began. An alliance between Vader and Venator could threaten Palpatine's reign in ways that the Rebel Alliance never could. They possessed intimate knowledge of Imperial operations, commanded respect and fear throughout the galaxy, and most importantly, they both had personal reasons to want revenge against the Emperor. For a moment, it seemed as though the course of galactic history might change. Venator struggled to his feet, his yellow eyes meeting the hidden gaze behind Vader's mask. The two Sith Lords stood in the ruins of the ancient temple, surrounded by the broken stones of a philosophy that had once stood for hope and justice, contemplating an alliance that could reshape the galaxy. But the moment passed. Venator's training had been too thorough, his indoctrination too complete. The idea of betraying his father, even after learning the extent of his manipulation, was beyond his psychological conditioning. "No," he said finally, his voice carrying genuine regret. "I cannot. He is my father, my master, the architect of everything I am. Whatever his methods, his vision for the galaxy is correct. The strong must rule, and the weak must serve. That is the way of the Sith." Vader nodded slowly, understanding the choice even as he regretted it. "Then this ends as it must," he replied, raising his lightsaber once more. The final exchange lasted only seconds. Venator, weakened by his failed attempt to channel contaminated Force energy, could no longer match Vader's